I think what philosophy does, one way to think of what it does is because we study problems, we show how you can study problems, which means that we can thematize a problem as a problem, which means that we're studying various possible solutions to it. And since the problems we study are so difficult, we're lingering in the moment of inquiry where we generate different possible solutions to a problem, and then we explore for each of those solutions what it has going for it and what maybe some of its pitfalls are surrounding it. And I think that's a form of knowledge, or at least a form of understanding.
Welcome everyone to today's interview, where we are very pleased to welcome Professor Susanna Siegel. She is Edgar Pierce Professor of Philosophy at Harvard University, and her work focuses on mind, epistemology, perception, and some related topics. Her books include The Contents of Visual Experience and The Rationality of Perception, and she has a variety of published articles. Feel free to add anything, but with that, welcome and thanks so much for being here, Professor Siegel.
Thanks a lot, Trey.
All right, so a lot of my questions here are going to focus on some of your work on perception and the rationality of perception. And in that book that I mentioned in the introduction, you defend that view that that perceptions can themselves be rational or irrational and deserving of various reactive attitudes and so forth. And this is, I take it in contrast to the more mainstream view in epistemology that this is true only of like beliefs and stuff. So first, can you speak briefly on the thesis here and why hasn't this been a more common view in epistemology and the philosophy of perception?
I think the main reasons it hasn't been a common view is because the ordinary kind of theory of perception is guided by our experience, which is just open your eyes and the world shows up to you in some way. And so it just seems as if, this is where the idea of the given comes from. It's that, this is what we begin with, is what we find in perception. And then our mind makes something of the information we get from perception by combining it with stuff we already know or believe or want. And so, because it feels just given, all of the many constructive aspects of it are hidden from view. So, for a long time, most of the development of Anglo-analytic philosophy that treated perception, it developed during a time when there was very little interface between philosophy that treated perception, which is mostly in epistemology at first, and the sciences, the science of perception. So it was in the science of perception where the constructive nature of it was brought to light. But when philosophers theorized about perception as a branch of epistemology, which is how it began before we had such a thing as, philosophy of perception as a branch of the philosophy of mind, it was just theorized about in a way that didn't draw on they didn't really have access to the intellectual, milieu in which it just was, discovered that actually perception is constructed at least in the subpersonal way. So what the rationality of perception does is it asks whether there are any aspects of this constructive nature of perception which could matter at the person level. And that in turn is a question that the sciences aren't really equipped to answer because it's often not explanatorily important in the science of perception to draw that distinction between what happens at the person level and subpersonally, for one thing. And even when it is important, as for example, it comes up in the debates about whether there's such a thing as unconscious perception, even when it is important, often the epistemic categories aren't important. So what the rationality of perception does is it brings these two things together. The idea that there might be some aspects of the processes by which perceptual experiences are generated, the experiences that just feel like you're experiencing a world that's just simply disclosed to you because of the way the world is, not because of the way you are, and then asks whether any of those processes could even in principle be ones that could be susceptible to epistemic evaluation of some sort. So, in answer to the question of why did people think of this before? In a way, people did think of it before, to the extent that when they weren't, traditions of theorizing that aren't so much fixated on distinguishing sharply between, perception and belief, or perception and action, or perception and dispositions to act, like in the phenomenological writings of Merleau-Ponty, for example. It doesn't seem particularly strange to claim that perceptual experience could be subject to normative evaluations of some kind. And that idea that for sure is in Merleau-Ponty. But it doesn't seem like such a radical idea because it doesn't have such a strict distinction between, what's perceptual and what's not perceptual. So when we have in Anglo-analytic philosophy, when we do have that distinction, that's when it comes to be that distinction that was thought to correlate between, as you said at the beginning, the distinction between like perceptual experience and post-perceptual things was thought to correlate between something that's just kind of given and something that's like space of reasons, or something that's susceptible to normative evaluation downstream, and that's what I'm questioning.
Yeah, some really good points there, and yeah, so part of the idea there is, as you say, maybe historically and still somewhat to this day, people just assume that, well, there's this that everything is in perception is sort of just given. It's not depending on sort of other psychological features which sort of construct the sort of experiences that we have, and other things that themselves could be rationally evaluable or epistemically evaluable. And insofar as we recognize that this is a myth, if you want to put it that way, then it at least opens the door for thinking that they are so valuable in that way.
Right.
If that makes sense.
I mean, it wouldn't open the door if you just assume that all of the constructive processes of perception, and sort of the thing that the sciences of perception can study, are necessarily all subpersonal, or necessarily somehow just not something we could raise any normative questions about, for example, because it isn't subject to our control. That's another idea a lot of people have. They think, well, so I've been focusing on kind of background assumptions about perception, but you could also focus on background assumptions about normative evaluability, and in particular epistemic evaluability or moral evaluability. If you think like, well, those you gotta have been able to do otherwise, or you have to have been able to control it, or it had to somehow be intentional, or something you could monitor, something you could intervene on and make a difference to. One type of argument has, a first premise that says that one of something in the family I just mentioned is necessary for valuability, and then a second premise that says, and we don't find that in perception, and then from those two premises concludes, and so perception is not evaluable in the way that's tied to the feature in the first premise.
Right. Yeah, and I'm going to say more on that, but another thing you've defended, including in that book, is what you call the downgrade thesis. And so, roughly speaking, on this thesis, I take it, experiences can have more or less like epistemic weight, depending on certain psychological features and like antecedent conditions. So, for example, if a perception is influenced greatly by some irrational fear, the rationality of this perception and conclusions drawn from it might be significantly reduced. Could you talk about this a bit, and maybe how this is relevant to real life examples of perceptions influenced by racial biases, for example?
Yeah, sure. So if you set aside perceptual experience for a moment and just think about how people draw inferences by combining maybe some new, how they draw inferences in real time, from information they have stored in their mind, including, or misinformation, including prejudices, and then information they get at a moment, we have no trouble with the idea that if the prejudices that you use to combine with the new information are epistemically poorly supported, then the conclusion you draw from the inference would be poorly supported. So for example, If you see somebody and your prejudice kicks in, and just from their kind of social perception of them, you think this person's probably incompetent or stupid, or they don't know what they're talking about, or they're dangerous, or whatever it might be. It's kind of textbook case of an epistemically faulty inference that's faulty, not because the reasoning is bad, but because the premise is bad. So you have like a premise that says, people with features X are, have some negative feature. People with feature X are incompetent. This person's got feature X, and so this person is incompetent. So, valid reasoning, but epistemically poor conclusion because of the premise. People with feature X are incompetent. That's like it's false, and if it's a prejudice thing, then in some sense it's not justified. So on my analysis, you could have this exact same structure. It's just that the conclusion that you're drawing is actually an experience. So experience can be the conclusion of an inference. That's one of the main theses of the rationality of perception, and that's what I call, so downgrade. Epistemic downgrade is my label for what happens to the power of an experience to provide justification for belief. So if the experience is the result of an inference that has the structure and the characteristics that I just outlined, then that experience, which is the conclusion, doesn't have as much epistemic power as that exact same phenomenally individuated experience could have if you didn't come at it that way. So, in the examples of, you could do this with anything. The prejudice examples, I think, are especially powerful because, because they raise so many other interesting questions, but also because it just seems something, it seems a little odd to conclude that, I'll actually be totally fine if you thought this was a reasonable way to move through the world, and, it seemed that's what your parents taught you and seemed totally fine. So it's like the idea there's nothing epistemically wrong with what you've arrived at, that it's totally justified. I think that's a very good case to test a theory against, especially when you consider it kind of from the receiving end of someone who is like, you tell someone, well, yeah, they thought you were totally incompetent, but, they were totally justified because of these lies that had seeped into their mind. These malicious lies that seeped into their mind, they're actually totally justified. It's very hard conclusion to swallow. So that's one reason why I focus on those sorts of cases. And that's the analogy that the burden is on me to defend. And that's what I spent a lot of the book defending is, we don't have any, because there's no question about it being a poor epistemic upshot in the case where the conclusion is a belief. I'm posing this challenge of like, well, suppose the conclusion was an experience, then would everything somehow be different? Suppose you formed the belief on the basis of an experience that was in turn produced through this inference. Would it like somehow be okay just because you had an experience in the middle of the chain? And I mean, that's not the argument, but that's the question. That's the sort of rhetorical question that gets us thinking about the issue.
Yeah, it's almost like saying, okay, you agree that there can be irrationality in this sort, in this case. These cases seem to be relevantly similar. So why wouldn't there be in this case?
Right.
And part of how you try to show that they can be relevantly similar is that the experience actually really does involve an inference of a certain sort. And and part of how you defend that, or at least undermine a particular objection against it, is by denying that that inferences require a so-called reckoning state.
Right.
So roughly speaking, the reckoning view maintains that to make some inference from like certain premise states to a conclusion state, we must also sort of exhibit a state of reckoning that the premise state epistemically supports the conclusion states. So the support that someone might offer in favor of this might be as follows. If reckoning isn't required, then what's to distinguish a series of states which are connected inferentially with another series of states which aren't? It might be argued that the no reckoning view can't account for this difference, at least in many cases. What do you think of this?
Yeah. I mean, the key notion for me is the idea of a specific type of responsiveness, a way of responding to the information that I say you're drawing, that is a specifically inferential way of responding. And my reason for thinking that there is a special kind of responsiveness comes from the wide range of examples that, again, don't involve the rationality perception thesis. They don't count on the idea. They don't take as already understood the thing I'm trying to ultimately defend, that experiences themselves can be conclusions of inferences. But you can draw. I think we very often reach conclusions through inference without any reckoning state, and even without being disposed to articulate some reckoning state. There's a lot of, like, the literature on thin slicing from social psychology, where people arrive at assessments of others in all sorts of very complex ways, just kind of at an instant. You think that somebody's kind just from seeing the way they handle a package in the post office, is one of my examples. And I think in these cases, there can be things that you are responding to, like the way the person handles the packages, and her tone of voice and her care with which she's handing, the things back to the customer, and things like that. There are things that a good novelist might pick out just the right detail that conveys the sense of this worker at the post office to a reader, because the novelist knows which details are going to be telling, which ones are going to create a vivid picture in our mind. And the fact that you can do that in art, the fact that you can do that in fiction, is a strong clue that actually in perception we respond to details like that. And the fact that when you read a piece of fiction where the telling detail is so telling, and sort of marvel at the fact that you understand so much about a character despite having been told so little by the author, the fact that we marvel at those things shows something else, which is that oftentimes we are responding to various cues without knowing what we are responding to, without having beliefs about what we're responding to, without being able to reconstruct what we're responding to. And all those things, to me, suggest very strongly that we don't have a reckoning state. Because if we had a reckoning state, there's lots of different things a reckoning state could be, and I go through some of them in the chapter on inference in the book, and in a paper I published after the book too, called Inference Without Reckoning. But so there's a lot of different things it could be, but one of the things you might think a reckoning state would have to be, would be something that connected the specific cues you're responding to with the conclusion. So the idea of a reckoning state is like premise 1, premise 2, and then if premise 1 and 2, then 3. So I have some third kind of state whose content does the bridging, you said, I think, between the premises and the conclusion. But to have that in these very simple perceptual cases or thin slicing cases, you would need to have a mental state that identifies those features you're responding to and links them up with the conclusion. And that's what I'm saying. We don't often have. We do respond to them, but we are not aware of responding to them, which suggests we don't have like a belief of responding to them. And of course, the natural move for the reckoning theorists to make is that, well, okay, yeah, we're not aware that we have these sort of unconscious states, unconscious reckoning states. They try to kind of split the difference between what I'm saying, which is that you just do respond without having a belief about what you're responding to. They try to split the difference between saying you just respond, you don't have a belief, and the opposite extreme, which is very implausible, that you have this like super hyper aware belief, and the idea that we always have that underlying these inferences made very implausible by the considerations I gave about fiction and the telling detail, and just the fact that oftentimes you just say, why do you think she's kind? Like, I don't know, I just kind of had the impression that she was kind, or I just kind of had the impression this guy was a jerk. I mean, these things happen, these judgments happen all the time. There's lots of evidence that one reaches judgments like extremely quickly that are extremely sophisticated. So somehow our minds are putting together, somehow our minds are at a minimum responding to these things. And the philosophical issue is whether that response always takes the form of, this other state, which you can identify psychologically as something over and above the mere response. So my reason for favoring the reckoning view and the idea that I'm sure there is this distinctive type of responding that's very easy to distinguish from just a sequence of things in the mind. We have all sorts of sequences of things in the mind that are not like this. First I see first I see the bird fly by, and then I hear the bus drive by, and nobody thinks that's an inference. And there's no special type of responding. My hearing of the bus is not a response to the flying of the bird. It's just like first one thing and then another thing. So there's no temptation, there's no danger of kind of over generating, this distinctive kind of responding to wrongly encompass like mere sequences of perceptions, or for that matter, mere sequences of thoughts. So we know that there is responding. We know that there isn't this kind of hyper self-aware, very detailed thing. The question is whether there's a viable, thing in the middle that's motivated to hold. And I'm arguing there isn't really that place in the middle, and it's my opponent who has to sort of say why, like, there really is this thing. And I consider various on the behalf of this position, which I think is exactly where the issue has to be joined is, what are the resources of this other position? What are the weak points of my position? And so I try to work that through in the Inference of that Reckoning paper and in the chapter on inference in the book.
Yeah, those are some very good points. And like, especially on how the Reckoning view does seem to commit us to, well, the only kind of cases of inferences are these ones where we're sort of aware of each step in the process and that the steps support some conclusion. But yeah, it seems right to me that there are all sorts of other states and processes that don't seem to fit that bill. But that are rightly called inferential since they share the sort of relevant features. And some of the stuff you said there seemed, I'm going to get to a question later about attention that seems a bit relevant to that as well. But just more specifically on that, like, do you think there's going to be some vague or sort of gray area between the states which are rightly called inferential and those which are maybe just, I don't know, like learned associations and stuff that maybe aren't inferential in the same way? Or is there sort of a sharp distinction on your view?
Yeah, no, I think there's definitely a sharp distinction. I think it should be said that the idea of association, the concept of association is really kind of multifaceted. And it's one of these words that's used in confusingly different ways by psychologists and philosophers, even when we're trying to talk about the same general phenomenon. So it's worth maybe drawing some distinctions. For example, in psychology, there's the idea of an associative learning process where you learn after, in response, your mind moves from the tokening of one concept to the tokening of another concept. And this is a relationship between concepts and tokening of concepts, which isn't necessarily a relation between, tokening an entire proposition and tokening another entire proposition. So it's like salt and pepper, or black and white, or black and crime. If there are associative links between these concepts, then if you have learned to link the concepts, all you have learned is that, tokening one concept is leads you to token another concept, or that's the result of the learning is that your mind has that disposition, but that's not yet anything, as Eric Mandelbaum points out in an early paper called Against Belief, that's not yet anything with syntactic structure, that's not yet anything at the level of propositions. And so it's a very poor tool for trying to, for example, analyze the process by which you form an implicit bias or an explicit bias. If anything, it's a byproduct of some other type of thing that came from a very different type of learning than just association. Because the other thing about associative learning is supposed to happen by exposure. This is why it's one of the main tenets of empiricism. So that's associative learning, and then associative transitions in the mind would be a transition in which you move from the tokening of one concept to the tokening of another concept. Now, when that happens, that could happen via, having a thought, like a complete thought about salt, like the soup needs salt, to having another complete thought about pepper, the soup needs pepper. And that doesn't have to be an inference. That could be associative. That transition could display the associative learning of salt and pepper. But it's not like that's not yet an inference. But sometimes philosophers, especially in the inference the literature on inference, sometimes they use association in a much broader way that's not at all tied to associative learning. And that's when it's kind of just this dustbin category of everything, all transitions in the mind that aren't inference. then just get called associations. Like if you play that party game where like you say a word and then I say the word that comes to mind right away, and like somehow people find this amusing. So that's okay. But that is not necessarily revealing anything about associative learning. It's just like you said a thing and then I said a thing. This happens in conversation. You say a thing, I combine it with what I think, and then I have my concerns and I say a thing. And he said that exact same thing to somebody else, she'd say a different thing because, she got different things in her mind to begin with, different interests, different concerns, and so on. So there are all sorts of dynamic processes in the mind beyond associative transitions as a psychologist understands it, which is a very well-defined phenomenon, and inference, as philosophers try to understand it. That is like by far, that is just two types of transitions among a huge multitude of transitions that we just don't have that much theorizing about. Sometimes when philosophers use association or associative transitions to just mean anything that isn't an inference, that's a huge dustbin category that's going to connect all sorts of things. One type of thing that it will include, and I think this is what I actually like, as you can probably tell, I don't think it's very useful to use associations in this dustbin way. I think it's incredibly misleading because sometimes we really want to be talking about the more specific psychological thing. Other times you want to be talking about either things that aren't inference, or sometimes the dustbin category for not inference, but sometimes it's a dustbin category for things that are not evaluable, things that are not epistemically evaluable. And I definitely don't like that I don't like either of these dustbin uses. I don't like the first one, the not inference one, because it's too big and broad and because it's confusing, because it's the same word as psychologists use. I definitely don't like the, not evaluable one, because part of what we want to know, we want some independent characterization of the things that are evaluable and why, and the things that are not evaluable and why. So one sort of third type of dynamic transition in the mind that hasn't been much theorized, I call it I'm writing this book about salience, and it's the XYZ model. So you have what I call an outlook, which is a bunch of standing states of all sorts. They could include intentions, they could include values, they could include beliefs, suspicions, and so on. They could include all kinds of things. You have an outlook that's but what's important is that it's a standing state, a cluster of standing states. And then there's some sort of input. It could be perception, it could be a remark, like in conversation. And then the input together with the outlook, so, the input X together with the outlook Y, brings something to mind Z. So that's like this very general structure that captures conversation. It captures reading. I come to a text with everything I know and everything everything in my mind and all my experiences and so on. I come to the text with those things, memories of those things, and then I take it in and you read the same text. And the beauty of the seminar room, the beauty of an educational class, the beauty of a reading group, the beauty of the book club is that we have all these things to say to one another about the book, and you notice things I didn't notice. And it's partly just, chance you happen to notice this and I happen to notice that. Sometimes that accounts for the differences, but often what accounts for the differences are these differences in outlooks. You have moved from your outlook X, to the input Y that we both got to a different, subsequent state Z. So you've moved basically from Y to Z. You move from input, you move from this input thing that you got when you were reading, when you were listening, to a subsequent. So that's like a dynamic, that's a movement of the mind in, more or less the spontaneous flow of thought. It is not inference. It is not association necessarily, probably not association in psychologist sense. No special reason to think it would be association, or that it would be completely explicable in terms of association. But that's a kind of schema for talking about kind of what's raised to salience or what comes to our mind as a function of the other things in our outlooks. So I'm sort of inclined to think that that some of that you could find in the relationship between the outlook and the output. When the output is conditioned by the outlook together with the input, that you could find some evaluability there too, as a function of your outlook can be better, worse in various ways. Like you could have a prejudiced outlook. You get some input and you draw this, and your mind moves to the next thought. And even if it isn't an inference, it could still reflect some aspects of the outlook. But I'm straying a bit from your question. I'm just saying all these things so that I can, because you asked me like, well, how do you distinguish, association from inference? And so I told this long thing about, well, how should we think about association? Once we're very clear about, what association is in the psychologist sense, there's absolutely no trouble distinguishing it from inference. What we really need is we need like more analytic tools to describe the different types of dynamic transitions in the mind. And that's something I'm trying to provide with this little XYZ schema.
Yeah, that's a lot of interesting points there. And I guess part of what I have in mind is like, I mean, we can distinguish inferences that are like stronger from ones that are weaker. Like it's very clear the sort of inferential pathway that we have and how in some cases, how the sort of initial states support the latter or lead to the latter. And in other cases, it's much weaker. And maybe what I had in mind was that maybe in some cases it's so weak, like sort of connection is so weak that it's not clear. It's not obvious that we should even be counting it as an inference. So like maybe it's a bit vague. And does that make sense, or is that something we can roll out, or what do you think?
Yeah, it would be nice to talk through an example that has these ambiguities. And so I'll give you an example and you tell me if it has, if this is what you have in mind. So like, those experiments about the firefighters where you give, you ask people like, what's more important for firefighter, like street knowledge or school training? And then what you do is you vary whether you're asking them about this candidate, Jane, who has like more street knowledge, but less schooling, or this candidate, John, who has, more schooling, but less street knowledge. And then what you find is that whatever, you can vary it however you want to, but people will say, oh no, what's much more important is like whatever the male candidate has, because somehow that's what seems to be pulling the strings of their answers, is like, so that they think this is a little bit like the the old stockings example, the stockings in the window example, but so it's a little bit hard to, there's various things going on here. One is that a point about introspection or self-knowledge, people think that they are drawing an inference from, they think they're inferring from some judgment about what's more important for firefighting, street knowledge or training. They think they're drawing inference on this basis, but it appears that they have these dispositions to just, it appears, and maybe they are, like, it's very hard to say what's going on. Maybe they are drawing that inference. It's just that which inference they draw is conditioned by the sex of the person that they're asking about. So that's one possibility. Does the inference take the form of like, X is male, X has street knowledge, so street knowledge is more important for firefighting than expertise. That's one thing. And if that's their inference, then they don't know that that's their inference, but that doesn't stop it from being their inference. That's one thing that could be happening. Another thing that could be happening is the inference has nothing to do with like street knowledge or versus expertise at all. That's just some sort of noise in their mind. And, they're really just inferring, say, well, who's better prepared to be a firefighter, like John or Jane? And then really the inference, again, unbeknownst to them, is like, men are better at firefighting, John's a man, so John's better than Jane at firefighting. And then like expertise and street experience have, somehow don't come into the initial inference, though they might come into some justification they offer like afterwards. So I think, here are like, it's absolutely an empirical question of like, if there, some inference is going on, like you ask them a question, they give you an answer, and probably there's some inference going on. It looks like there's something inferential going on, but what inferential thing is going on? We don't know. They don't know. It looks like they probably don't know. But we don't know. We don't know either. We know only one thing from the experiments, which is that it seems to be sensitive to the sex of the person who they're asking about. But that's not enough to tell us, what kind of informational processing is their mind going through to get from, that constitutes that sensitivity. What form does their sensitivity take in terms of inference? Yeah.
So that might be a decent example. So like, so part of it is that like, we might think that they have these initial thoughts about the firefighters, street smarts, whatever, and then they think about they have that conclusion, I guess, if you want to talk about it in that way, about which is more important, but maybe it's not even, might not be clear that that conclusion was drawn inferentially from those prior beliefs. Maybe it was maybe it was, but it was really weak, or maybe it looks like it was. I mean, but it isn't. I mean, maybe this is sort of what I have in mind. But I mean, even more generally, I guess, the concern is that, I mean, psychologically, we're so complicated, and that in trying to give these relatively simple accounts of what our psychology is like, we might group things in ways that admit to some vague boundaries and maybe miss out on certain features that are important. I mean, maybe that's sort of the more general concern,
I see.
Methodological concern I have in mind.
I see. So you're thinking like maybe there's our mind might move from a starting point to an ending point, but that might not tell us whether what's mediating that transition is the specifically inferential kind of response. And perhaps there are cases that give us reason to doubt whether, just kind of leave it vague, whether the response that, I mean, maybe I shouldn't call it response, but leave it vague whether the transition where our mind is moving through is the inferential kind or not. So yeah, maybe the firefighter thing where you say like, Jane has more experience, John has more training, who's the better firefighter? John has more experience, Jane has more training, who's a better firefighter? I guess, it's very difficult when you are talking about prejudice, which takes the form of generalizations, and then somebody's somehow connecting a generalization to a particular instance to form a judgment about that instance. It's very hard. Maybe that's not a very good candidate for being vague about inference, because, somehow or other, the generalization is getting tied to the specific instance to produce a generalization informed verdict about the instance. So that sort of looks like it's kind of tailor-made for inference. So I guess I would have to think of some other example, or maybe you want to put forward some sort of example that's a better candidate for leaving it vague whether the response is inference or not.
Yeah, I probably should have thought of a specific example. I didn't, but maybe if something comes to mind, I can
Okay, yeah.
we can talk about that. But instead of spending so much time on that, I think I wanted to ask another question more related to sort of another approach someone might have on the rationality of perception. So what if someone were to so regarding how certain perceptions are deserving of negative reactive attitudes, and they're in some sense irrational in a way, we might say that the person who has these perceptions themselves had previous epistemic and perhaps moral commitments, obligations to develop the sort of beliefs and attitudes not conducive to these biased perceptions. And when they have these perceptions, this is a sign that they failed in those commitments, obligations, and so are deserving of the negative attitudes and so forth accordingly. I mean, what do you think of this approach? I mean, maybe it's not in tension with it, but with yours, but does it make sense to you?
Yeah, let's see. Can you give me again the first part about the, are you talking about like we have our sort of, we have our target of evaluability, this poor person who's the epistemologist has the misfortune to be examined by the epistemologist, even if only as some hypothetical thing. And so this poor person who's under our epistemologist spotlight, or even worse yet, our moral philosopher spotlight, we're like very judgmental, and we're looking at this person, and then can you just repeat the part about what, and before they've even done anything at all, we know some background stuff about them. Was it that we know that they are disposed to have certain perceptions, certain situations, or so they're disposed to have like stereotype, they're supposed to have harmful stereotype congruent perceptions.
Right.
And then were you asking whether like just on that basis alone, we can already like reach some verdict even before they've perceived anybody at all?
Well, that in principle maybe, but like the idea was that they've prior to that to even well, I don't want to say necessarily prior to developing them, but prior to the particular perceptions prior to developing the dispositions, I mean to say, but prior to even having the particular perceptions that are biased in this way, they had some commitment or obligation to, I don't know, not sort of develop those sorts of attitudes and perceptions. And that's something in a way which is under their control. They can, they were obligated to learn what the facts were about certain groups of people in the case of some sort of racial bias, for example, and develop the sort of expected attitudes or the reasonable attitudes, and so that they would have the unbiased perceptual responses, if that makes sense.
So they were under an obligation because they undertook the obligation, or that somehow we're just stipulating that they are obligated?
I mean, I left it open in the question that we could have either view. Maybe perhaps if we think that this might depend on what your view on obligations is of this sort, at least. If you think that someone has this, I mean, it's not a strange obligation to commitment to take anyway. If you think that to want to avoid or to avoid biased perceptions because they make your perceptions less truth tracking and so forth, and that might be a common commitment to have, if not an obligation that we're actually under regardless of commitments. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not sure if that
so
was.
We have. Yeah. That's okay. Yeah. So we have a person who, one way or another, does have an obligation to avoid these biased perceptions, but then doesn't meet the obligation, or anyway, then ends up having a biased perception.
Right.
And then what's the question about that? Whether there's this other bad making feature in it over and above the rationality perception story, or?
Well, yeah. So maybe someone might say that when we hold them accountable or whatever for, or say that they've done something wrong here, at least epistemically, they might say that it's only or primarily the failing to live up to that earlier commitment, not the just having that individual perception itself. So maybe it's
now I understand.
Yeah.
Okay, that's so interesting. So it's like, is this maybe a fair reconstruction that, like, I'm saying there are cases where you form a perceptual experience through an inference that has some epistemic problem with it. And so the perception is epistemically compromised as a result of resulting from an inference. And you're saying, well, is there a kind of structurally similar thing, which maybe could even, I suppose the next step somebody might say is like, it might replace the inference or be better than the inference model, but the kind of structurally similar thing, which is like, it's not so much that it's an inference that went wrong, but there is another bad making feature in that, people have an obligation not to have these sorts of perceptions, but that they have them anyway. Then there's a sort of kind of internal thing wrong with them in that they haven't lived up to this obligation that they have, or, whether they undertook it themselves or not, is kind of beside the point, like we're saying. So that could either be kind of an additional bad making track of that stuff, or it could be a substitute if one wanted to accept the rationality perception thesis, but tell a different story about what exactly the bad making feature is. One could try to tell a story in terms of, I have an obligation not to have this certain type of perception. Does that more capture it?
Yeah,
okay.
That's probably a better way to say it than I did. Yeah.
Okay, so I guess one small question is like about the content of the obligation. Like, I mean, if the obligation is not to have, it's not to have an epistemically bad perception, then it's sort of not going to be an alternative. It's going to be a kind of additional add-on to the rationality perception thing. Whereas if it's, I have an obligation never to have stereotype congruent perceptions, that might be too strong. I mean, like nothing stops there from being, like somebody who really isn't confident. Even they, they fit the stereotype, but they actually do fit the stereotype. Like obviously that could happen. So we don't want to not be able to see it when it's there. I mean, we don't want to substitute one sort of negative prejudice from just some sort of like inhuman positive prejudice. That's the whole problem with, the prejudices that blocks you from seeing things as they are, however they may be, and seeing things as they are because they are that way. And so sometimes sometimes you have a situation where actually people are congruent with the stereotype. That can happen. The problem was never that like it was always going to be wrong because nobody who's if we just take it, it's always awful, sort of yucky, I find, to use the genuine, to use the actual examples of stereotypes, because it's sort of just icky even to mention them sometimes. But if we say, so I like to use a fake one. I'll be like, people from New Jersey are like, people from New Jersey are really obsequious. That's good because it's, people are really obsequious, and then like it's like you'd be annoying to be, or it could be harmful even, and you could sure cook up a case where it's harmful if somebody is hell-bent on perceiving you as obsequious, even if you're not, but only on the basis of the fact that you're from New Jersey. It's sort of, everyone knows what it's like to be sort of summed up at a glance or something, where you're not actually being seen for what you are because somebody's in the grip of some other stereotype or something, just like Walter Lippmann described a long time ago. So like we definitely don't like it, and then sometimes much worse than not liking it. Sometimes it's harmful, but none of all of that is compatible with there actually being a person who is from New Jersey and is obsequious. And so if it's a stereotype, and so if we said like you had an obligation, you're never allowed to have any perception of someone as obsequious if they're from New Jersey, it doesn't seem like it would really be an obligation, is what I'm saying. So it seems like a poor candidate for it. Wouldn't be, I don't think we shouldn't posit that there is such an obligation, because that can't be the obligation, never to have a stereotype congruent perception, because sometimes the world is going to be such that some people actually do fit a stereotype.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, maybe the obligation is a little bit different, and maybe it varies in strength depending on the how. So in other words, maybe we can have a strong obligation not to have a very biased perception, especially of those that might be of moral significance, i.e., maybe some racial thing, and the obligation is weaker as for having against having weaker or less biased perceptions, if that makes sense. Maybe over in general, like maybe we can like fine grain the obligations in a particular way that sort of suits these cases, if that makes sense.
I mean, like, I think the same point would hold, because again, what's harmful about it is the status as a prior thing that's coloring your relationship to the particular people you encounter. Speaking as from the point of view of the prejudiced person, from the point of view of the person on the receiving end of the prejudice, that's also what's harmful, is that you're not able to, it clouds the human relationships. That's the problem with it. It clouds them. It prevents them from, it prevents people from seeing one another in the full multidimensionality that we are. So like the problem isn't, and that means the problem isn't that it's always false. Just like, if you think about the myths of criminalization that have, occur every time there's a kind of, truly culturally embedded, longstanding prejudice at a place, which happens in many places at many times. And with anti-Black racism is just one example. But like any kind of longstanding, culturally entrenched ideology that treats a group of people as not deserving of full political rights, it always has some sort of justifying ideology, that always has some myth of why, the targets of the thing don't really have full political rights. And, you saw this with, the anti-suffragist myths of why women shouldn't vote. And, there's no shortage of examples like that. And the thing is that sometimes some elements of the myth, can be correct in a given case. The problem with them wasn't that they're always, it's not that you put it this way, it's not that you combat if you want to combat the myths by telling the truth, the way to do that isn't to substitute a counter myth that like, actually everybody from this group is totally perfect and, has never committed any crimes at all. If it's a myth of criminalization, the defense against it isn't to say like, nobody, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? The segment of the population is like prone to, to commit crimes? No way. Everybody's extremely respectable. Nobody's ever committed a crime in their life. That's just like, that's not the way to show that it's false, because like sometimes people will commit crimes, and it's not like that was ever the problem, was that it was false in every case. The problem was that it was making a statement about every case, and that and the problem was that it's making a statement about every case, and that its role in society was to justify incredible violence and exclusions of economic and political kinds. Like that's kind of what was wrong with it, was both the form of it and what it did in that form, given that it had that form. These myths of criminalization, for example, they had to have the form of like sweeping generalizations in order to play their cultural historical role that they played. So when we come to it, this is one sort of pitfall, I suppose, of making it a topic in philosophy, where because we have a premium on precision and because we have a premium on being very exact, we sometimes just kind of like narrow in on like one, version, one exact just feature of the prejudice, and then we ignore like the rest of its historical role, and that could produce a misleading theory about like what was actually wrong with it. Like it can make us think, well, it's just that it was false, and so therefore, it must be bad always to think it, because you should never think anything false. But that's a mistake. That's a mistake.
Yeah, it's a very good point. I'll have to think more about that, but I did have another a question about the downgrade thesis. So one potential criticism is that it seemed to commit us to a sort of externalist view in epistemology. Well, I guess one you might let me know if you think that's right. But so things can make a difference to the rationality of some belief or perception, despite not being available, like accessible to the subject, or at least maybe not being available in that way. So in principle, such features might change unbeknownst to the subject, but it seems strange to me to suppose that there can be a change, maybe even a radical change in the epistemic features of a perception or a belief without some corresponding accessible phenomenal or intentional change. I think this is sort of the criticism that Peter Railton had, or someone had a similar criticism to this. Maybe Adam Potts.
I think Adam Potts had a criticism like this, because in the where did that come out? Trying to remember. Adam Potts and Peter Railton, their commentaries, I think they came out in analytic philosophy. Maybe that's not right. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting where it came. It didn't come out in analytic philosophy. It came out in I think it came out in PPR. I think it came out in PPR. So Adam Potts says, well, look at this case with tomatoes. Like you're hallucinating a tomato and it transitions seamlessly to perception and then back to hallucination and back to perception, adapting a thought experiment from Mark Johnston, and says like, oh, come on, it's just like from the inside, it's got nothing, there's no, from the inside, there's no difference at all. And yet, if this phenomenologically seamless transition is actually psychologically underwritten by, a process that I consider downgrading, I predict as downgrading in one case, and a process that's irrational in another case, it keeps going back and forth, then what we have to say, on my view, is that it's like the epistemic status of the experience flits back and forth as well and changes, even though like the subject, this hallucinator, has got no idea about the changes. So whereas the sorts of examples, and just sort of in terms of my process of thinking it through, just in terms of a sort of philosophical autobiography or something, was that I did start, I was a philosopher of perception who, so our lifeblood was tomatoes. Boy, did we get very far with tomatoes. Examples about tomatoes, hallucinating tomatoes, like all the theorizing was like constrained by this one type of case about like hallucinating, didn't have to be tomatoes, but just hallucinating things in this sort of context where there was no issue of uptake, or no issue of having to reconcile the epistemic verdicts we might reach with any broader situation. And when I began to think about other sorts of examples, I realized that, if we only theorize about the hallucinations of tomatoes and then let that be the guide to our epistemology, we're going to be making predictions about all these other sorts of social cases where those predictions just seem, bad. So which thing is supposed to be like guiding our theorizing? And when I, think about the cases that I talk about where, and they definitely for sure have real life, they have real life analogs. It's very hard to tell when somebody is, no real good way to know whether, when, somebody who has the power to actually kill somebody on the basis of their impression, when they do that and report, well, this guy looked really dangerous. I thought I was in a dangerous situation. It's very hard to tell empirically whether, well, did you have experience or were you just like drawing a conclusion from your experience? It's hard to tell that in a given case, which is why I haven't pursued it more as a thing with real life applications. I think it has incredibly interesting applications for the reasonable person standard in the law, which we can talk about maybe afterward. But it's just that if you say like, oh, actually, if you really did hallucinate, because it's the XYZ structure all over again, if the outlook in your mind, which was prejudiced, really did, and which was prejudiced and perhaps informed by being told over and over again in your police training that you are entering, a war zone, like you are entering a space where your life's going to be in danger, and all of this things that you've been told makes you hallucinate. And then like you shoot this child because you hallucinated that he was, towering over you and 20 years old, and really he was just a 12-year-old kid, with a water pistol. It just doesn't, it's like no consideration about tomatoes is going to make me think like, oh yeah, actually it was reasonable, to think this, given how unreasonable it was to have those expectations in the first place, unreasonable, even if like understandable. So that's where I was, so yeah, like phenomenologically, it all gets back to the point that we started with. The perception phenomenologically is always just like the world's disclosing itself to you. And if we took that phenomenology and the very powerful introspection of that phenomenology, which doesn't actually, it's very hard to disrupt. That's one place where introspection is very powerful. It's very hard to disrupt the introspective access to perception as to perceptual experience as something in which the world is disclosing itself to us. It's the world that's presenting itself as like a gloomy, horrible place when your, pessimism gets the better of you and you just find yourself in a world that's like full of crappy things, or take a happier example, when the world just seems incredibly beautiful and wonderful, it really seems to be in the world. It always seems to be in the world. It always, like, that's just a feature of perception that introspection doesn't seem to ever give up on. That's always how it seems to us. So the fact that the way it seems to us might mislead us to our epistemic situation. Maybe the world isn't actually full of crap. Maybe the world isn't actually all that great. All right, maybe it isn't. Maybe we're wrong. Maybe we're unjustified or something. But it always seems to us like we have completely, righteous perceptions. It's almost like perceptual phenomenology comes with its own righteousness. But that's to me like a very weak thing to take as a guide to epistemic status at all. Just like you could say, like the person, actually I have a great quote from Hitler, who after he like tried to start this coup in 1923, in the beer hall, which didn't work, and then got put in prison for it, he was like, I don't feel like a criminal at all. It's like, because I'm against crime that I was trying to do this because this regime was completely, fraudulent or something. It's like, that's what it seemed to him, and then you're like, oh, well, don't we have to respect that to like give him some epistemic status? No, we don't have to respect that to give it like some epistemic status.
Right. Yeah, so I guess part of what you said there is that we shouldn't be just we're relying on these particular strange cases to drive our conclusions about the rationality perception here, or downgrade. Or
I think that if you consider a range of cases and they pull you in different directions, then you have to consider, one thing you could do, and Adam makes a very good point. He says, well, Susanna, how come you don't just say how come you don't just shrug and say, these cases pull me this way, these cases pull me that way, and then just leave it at that? Or why aren't you like 50-50 as to whether the rationality of perception thesis is true? Why do you give more weight to these other sorts of cases? And the answer is that that those cases are clear cases. The tomato cases, he thinks it's a clear case because he's wedded to this idea that any kind of epistemic change would have, he might dispute this formulation of it, but there's some sort of thesis linking to introspectability of a change with an epistemic change. And what the thing, I'm not an externalist, I'm not a reliabilist. It's much easier to defend, or anyway, straightforward to defend the rationality of perception on, if you are a reliabilist, not that you're forced into it. But no, I'm actually not a reliabilist. I think that the inferential processes that make perceptual experiences epistemically better or worse, that those things are at the person level, they're not accessible. They're not accessible, so they're not internal to introspection, but they are internal to the mind. So I'm actually with Tim Williamson here too. I believe he says at one point, that internalism and externalism, I might well be quoting, but internal, they just, they're very underdefined terms. So you can be internal to the mind, but external to attention, for example. You could be internal to the mind, but external to consciousness. And so we just generate all of, in a way, Alston made this point a very long time ago. We have all of these different types of positions in epistemology, and like if you're, okay, I'm an externalist if what you had to be internal to was like some internal to anything that you're aware of about your own mind. Okay, well then I'm an externalist. But if it's like, it's not external to the mind, it's internal to the mind. So, call it what you want. So yeah, if it is externalist in that way, but it's just the terminology is more confusing than it is helpful when you start to talk about positions like these.
Right. Yeah, that's a fair point. So part of what's going on there is that you think the pull of these cases is stronger or more clear than some of these other cases.
Yeah.
So that's a more reasonable conclusion to draw. Downgrade and rationality perception. Do you think that we would still want some account or explanation of why we have these sort of misleading intuitions, or at least some people have these misleading intuitions in these other cases? Or
well, I think we have a very clear account of why we have those intuitions. It's again gets back to the thing we began with. It's because no matter how much, even the people who think that the mind is like shot through, there's no kind of non-political, non-social aspects of the mind. I'm not sure I completely think that, but even the people who think that, cannot deny that perception works very well much of the time in this kind of quotidian way of like, you open a fridge and you can find the mustard if you're looking for it most of the time. Or if you do find the mustard, you're like, I found the mustard. And that it's as simple as that. You can find the door, you can go into the elevator and know that there's two people in it, and just all these ways that perception works extremely well. And our phenomenology of perception, is very seamless in so many cases that nobody bothers, except for philosophers, to theorize about. And so that's the reason why, that's a sort of segment of life that gives us so much confidence that we must therefore know like the epistemic status of, we must know about we must be good judges of the epistemic power of experience, because we live through so many instances, kind of quotidian banal instances, where our experience guides us pretty well. So I completely understand if somebody has, it's a sort of like the types of things people say when they're trying to be anti-skeptical in the context of discussing philosophical skepticism about the external world. Those kinds of things, which I think we should do justice to, those sorts of things could, give us reason to think like that our perception is our experiences are a good justifier, and we know it, and it always is, and that's a fact about that's just a fact that goes with the phenomenology of perception, not with anything else. I think that's an excellent explanation for why people have those other intuitions.
Yeah, fair enough. And just like in the background of a lot of these discussions and a lot of this literature is maybe a lot of unstated assumptions about how knowledge works or justification, like views on epistemology that aren't sometimes not specified or stated. Do you think you have to engage in those sorts of debates? Like, I mean, are we considering, are we foundationalists, or how do we think about that? And is that necessary for having these sorts of, or resolving these sorts of disputes on the level of perceptions and justification? Or what do you think the connection is between these debates and some of those more general epistemological debates?
You mean, what's the connection between like the debate over the rationality of perception and thesis and foundationalism?
Yeah, or just, but foundationalism as an example, but like just how to think about what justification is and what knowledge is more generally, I guess. And disputes about foundationalism might be one of those, but
yeah,
one of the two there.
I think they're pretty cross-cutting, honestly. I mean, for example, the knowledge first approach to perceptual knowledge, you could completely recast everything I say about the rationality of perception by asking whether the route to knowledge can be disrupted in, through the processes that I'm describing. I conduct my entire discussion using an idea that the knowledge first paradigm rejects, which is that there is a thing that isn't knowledge that can contribute to knowledge, namely perceptual experience. They just don't do business with that. So the experience, either when in the good case, your experience is a form of knowledge, in the bad case, it isn't. So my question about cognitive penetrability and perceptual, what I call perceptual hijacking, which is my label for what happens when too much weight is given to some bad premises of the sort of the exposition in the XYZ schema. That's just you could see me as theorizing about, in the language of the knowledge first paradigm, you could see me as theorizing about a specific type of route to the bad case. Can this be a route to the bad case? They want to talk about the good case where there isn't a kind of contribution of experience to the subsequent thing, which is knowledge, and that's fine. I mean, I'm always much more interested in the bad case anyway.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I wanted to move on to, well, it's sort of related, but as I alluded to earlier, so you've also defended in a paper with Nicholas Sillins the view that attention is not necessary for perceptual justification. I think that's how you put it. So as you say, part of the support for this view comes from the fact that we can develop beliefs and guide our actions based on perceptions of things and features to which we're not attentive. However, I wonder to what extent such processes, beliefs formed from unintended perceptions, should count as inferential or justificatory as opposed to just another cause of a mental state. Maybe this is a similar worry to the one I had about reckoning. But does it make sense to you? And
yeah, let's see. Can we talk through an example? So you're interested in the inattentive experiences and their justificatory role.
Yeah. So I don't know if this is the sort of thing that counts. Like people often talk about how when you're driving, often you'll seem to make inferences or be able to drive competently, even without being attentive, like consciously attentive to a lot of things in your environment. So it seems that you're operating based on information that you've learned in a way, but you're not attentive to. But I mean, so someone might say that in a case like that, what's going on there is that these features have led to, in a way, that maybe they've caused this behavior and certain development of certain beliefs, maybe. But why think of that process as inferential or justificatory? Maybe that's the way. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. Like part of the, I mean, I was talking before about the Adam Potts view that says that your phenomenal experiences, your phenomenal consciousness is sort of like co-varies with justificatory power. So if you hold that constant, then justificatory power supervenes on the phenomenology. And of course, I reject that idea. But one way to see that idea that I reject is actually sort of an extreme idea, is that you don't have, in order to reject that idea, you don't have to say that there's no epistemic power that goes with phenomenology per se. I actually think there is. It's just that the reason my book has complexity in it is because especially in the middle sections where I'm talking about losing power, gaining power, and it's all like incredibly detailed and stuff. The reason that that's all there is because I respect the point that I think when you asked me like, well, why do people have this intuition that you say is wrong? And then it's like, well, here's why they have this intuition, because they think, they know perceptual, phenomenology is often epistemically very powerful. So I actually grant that idea. It's just that the reason, I have a complex version of that idea, which says that there's a baseline amount of epistemic power that you get from the phenomenal character of a perceptual experience. So here I'm, acknowledging the force of the intuition and also of what I take to be the, Adam Potts's core thought. And he's such a wonderful articulator of this position. It's just that I think it can be modulated. It can be affected. You can lose it, if it's brought about by, a faulty inference or something. So in the case of so then the question arises of like, well, what was it really that, my dog is barking. What was it really that was a source of that epistemic power? Was it phenomenal character, or was it attentive? Was it phenomenal character of especially attentive experience? And what Nico Solms and I made the case for in a pair of papers about this question was that it actually is phenomenal character. It actually isn't specifically attentive phenomenal character. So when G.E. Moore says like, here's a hand, and it's like, is it like, did it matter that he was like paying attention to the hand? Would it have been enough if he was like a peripheral experience to him? So, I try to make the case that it really does go with phenomenal character. And Ned Block's made a good case that, convincing case to me that yeah, there's kind of degrees of attentiveness that can go with various experiences. So if you really think, and here I'm agreeing with Adam Potts and many other people whose feelings he's articulating, that there is something incredibly epistemically powerful about phenomenal character, then it's not really going to come that far apart from attentiveness. Of course, that raises the question of what does it add? Isn't it a little better? Don't you kind of like, look, why do you have to pay attention to things? Why is it epistemically better? Why is your epistemic situation so obviously improved when you pay closer attention? Why do we so often tell people to pay closer attention to something if we think they're not getting the point, or if we think that they haven't found the thing they're looking for in a room or something, so we have to say something about that. But the thing to say about that is because it just gives you more experiences of different places, and, like look harder and then maybe you'll find your keys. Like look in more places, you'll have more experiences. It's not like stare more carefully at this one spot. It's like explore the space more thoroughly or something. So I think there's reasons you could acknowledge the point that paying more attention sometimes makes things epistemically better, without saying that all along what really had this kind of default epistemic power was an attentive visual experience or perceptual experience.
Right. Yeah, that's an interesting point. But on that, would you say that take one perceptual experience where sort of in the person's visual field there's a red ball, but they're not very attentive to it, and suppose alternatively that they had that same perceptual experience but they were attentive to it, would the inferences that they might draw about the ball in their visual field be equally strong, or
it depends on I think we have to ask like, justification for what? So another dimension of the complexity that I subject my readers to in those middle chapters of the book is the precision about like, if you have an perceptual experience at P, does it give you justification for P? Does it give you justification, for that same content? Or does it give you justification for some other things? We just, so the idea that like your experience just has some justificatory power for anything, like it doesn't have justificatory power for anything. So if you have an inattentive experience and it's got as a result, a different content, perhaps a less detailed content than a more attentive experience, they might still be epistemically equally powerful. It's just relative to different things. So, your less attentive experience will be just as epistemically powerful as the other one, but relative to perhaps a less detailed proposition, going with the less specific contents that it has.
Yeah, that's fair. What if the proposition in question was like, I don't know, just that there is a red ball in front of me, and in the inattentive case, that's not
right.
You're maybe not fully aware that there's an object there. You're not attending to the fact that there's an object there, but it's still given in your perception in a way.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's various things that can happen. So one thing that can happen in a very quick, for example, a quick experience or inattentive experience is you can have competing cues for things. So you can have like, you think like this always happens in the sort of typical mouse case, like, was that a mouse? It's like something, yeah, what was it? And you're like not even sure sometimes whether you saw it or something. It's just, it had to be inattentive because by the time you were ready to attend to it, it was gone. The mouse was gone. So in those cases, you have, your overall experience your experience could present you with some features that support there being a ball, but it could also present you with some features that, are compatible with there not being a ball, or maybe it wasn't red. So like you can be presented in one and the same experience with competing cues for a certain proposition. So relative to and when you aggregate them, you might have, less, you might have, what is given with the hand of one set of features could be taken away by the other set of features. So that could account for why you have less reason to think that there's a ball.
Yeah, but what's making are we saying that the thing that's making the difference there is where your attention is, or there's some other difference in the perceptual experience?
Well, I mean, like I thought we were like stipulating, that we were comparing two experiences, one's more attentive, one's less attentive. Then if we say, well, no, the content is the same both times. If the content is exactly the same both times, one's just less attentive than the other, so that like the attentional difference isn't actually making a content difference, then I don't think there's that much pressure to say there's a big justificatory difference if you've really gotten as far as there being a ball both times. Jessie Munton in her wonderful paper called, I don't know what it's called, like visual experience and perceptual confidence, or just perceptual confidence or something like that. She talks about cases like these where she tries to construct cases that have exactly the structure you're describing now, where you do hold constant the content, but you change what she calls the kind of degree of confidence you have in it, which she wants to locate not as a post-perceptual thing, but somehow in the experience. And I argue against this view in a paper in Mind and Language from last year called How Can Perceptual Experiences Explain Uncertainty, with the idea that, there's various arguments for why we don't really have at least credence-like structures, right, in experience. But what we can have as a thing that, the way experiences can interact with uncertainty is, because she considers cases of like the tree and the fog. So, a tree when it's not that foggy and a tree when it's more foggy. And she's trying to say, look, it's a tree is in the content of both your experience, but one's foggy and one's not foggy. And so one's sort of like you experience less confidently and the other more confidently. So she talked about supposed confidence, the thing she would call visual confidence, as opposed to attentiveness, but it's kind of got the same structure. But I think that it's that as like more attentive and less attentive. But if you have a pair of cases of more attentive and less attentive cases, where in both cases the stimulus anyway really is a red ball, it's a little bit like the Munton cases where you have some epistemic difference and you think like, to what do we attribute this epistemic difference? In that I'm sort of more confident or more certain or perhaps more justified, more rationally certain, so more justified in one case than the other. And I think that in whether we're talking about differences of attentiveness or just differences in fog, the reason that I'm like have less justification to believe there's a tree when it's lots of fog is because there's lots of fog. So, I have some cues that it's a tree, but because there's fog, I have these other cues that perhaps it's a pole. I mean, could be like, I don't even get to have that it's a tree content, but I'm trying to grant her premise of like, you really do have it's a tree in both cases, but you could have it's a tree, and then you could also have some other information, pulling against that hypothesis. And then that would leave you, it's understandable if that leaves you less certain about it being a tree at the end of the day, or less justification, because it's just like having, a body of evidence that has, like it would be like, you have a body of evidence and some of the evidence points in the direction of it's a tree, but then some of it points in the other direction. And that's why you have less overall justification.
Yeah. I'm going to check that out. That's some good points though.
It's a great paper.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I did look at that paper of yours, but I didn't read it fully. The one you mentioned on uncertainty and perception. I did want to close in a couple minutes, but and I'll end as I often do with a sort of more general question about sort of the value of philosophy. And I know you had an article from last year where you sort of discussed some of the contributions that philosophy can make in the study of mind. And we're just wondering, like, I mean that's definitely going to be part of it, I guess, but more generally, what you think of as the value and of philosophy, I guess, both to you and to intellectual endeavors more generally into society.
Yeah, that's what a great question. The piece I think you're referring to came out in the Philosopher's Magazine called "What Can Philosophy Contribute to the Study of the Mind?" And it was based on actually a debate I had with Steven Pinker some years ago that some students set up who were in the mind, brain, and behavior program. And initially it was like, what can the humanities contribute to the study of the mind? Which almost seems like, as if one side's going to say nothing and the other side's going to say a lot. So I was the side that said a lot, but using philosophy as a specific case. But I think what philosophy does, one way to think of what it does is, because we study problems, we show how you can study problems, which means that we can thematize a problem as a problem, which means that we're studying various possible solutions to it. And since the problems we study are so difficult, we're lingering in the moment of inquiry where we generate different possible solutions to a problem. And then we explore for each of those solutions what it has going for it and what maybe some of its pitfalls are surrounding it. And then we do that and I think that's a form of knowledge, or at least a form of understanding. A form of understanding. When you understand a problem, you understand what the possible potential solutions to it are, and that helps you understand the problem. And maybe eventually, one sort of finds the real solution to the problem. But but even if you don't, that you can still gain a lot of understanding. So on this sort of very old and kind of a controversial question of whether there can be progress in philosophy, I think that's one way. One thing that progress looks like is understanding problems. And I don't think we should underestimate how important it is to understand problems, because if you live in a world that's dominated by technological expertise, full of people who think they have the answers to things, and they do have the answers to things, what they don't always have is a lot of reflectiveness about which problems need solutions, which questions need answers. And as the pragmatists argued 100 years ago, that's always a value question. Which questions and problems should we devote our resources to trying to solve and answer? Like, which medical endeavor should we put our resources into? So in the pandemic, it became profitable to try to find a vaccine. Of course, like we've had coronaviruses for ages. It wasn't especially profitable to find a vaccine for them, but it could have been very, very helpful to find it. It was a value decision to pour a lot of resources into finding drugs that be very expensive and help with like rare diseases, but not put it into finding solutions for things that are much more common. So that's just like one example of how It's a very familiar, relatable example of how you could have a lot of means to provide solutions to things, but philosophy reminds us as a kind of intellectual practice and set of habits of the importance and the possibility of actually studying problems and becoming aware of which questions are being asked in the first place and finding ways to evaluate them and ways to study problems themselves. So I guess those are sort of two different contributions it makes, two different contributions it makes through its focus on problems as a subject matter.
Yeah, that's a very good point, especially on the, on the value angle, which is perhaps a distinctively philosophical topic. So we'll end the questions there, and
okay.
Thanks again for being here and taking my questions and providing your very thoughtful responses. It's been excellent.
Thank you so much, Troy. It's great to meet you, and I appreciate your questions and your careful reading of things.